Well, thank you for joining us tonight at Torah to the Tribes. We have our special guest, Skip Moen, who's going to come and teach tonight. So give him a round of applause and welcome him all the way up here from Florida tonight. So welcome, brother. We're glad to have you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. And I'm pretty sure this is on, right?
Yep.
Yeah, okay, good. Oh, you can hear me. All right. Listen, if you don't like what you hear afterwards, you get a refund, right? So I got on the airplane, your time, at midnight yesterday, or midnight last night. So if I get a little, start winding down, it's because it's already 22 hours on the road to make this happen. And that's because of all kinds of issues with airplanes and everything else that eventually I got here. I'm really, really glad to be here. It's my first time ever doing anything in Oregon, so you're now a record breaker. And I'm sure it'll be a lot of fun. I have talked about this particular topic, which is the idea that Genesis is a tribal document written to people who needed to know about their identity, their purpose, their destiny, as they came out of Israel. And most of us, especially the ones that have come out of a Christian theological background, don't view Genesis like that. We view Genesis from a Greek perspective. In fact, the word Genesis is a Greek word, right, instead of Bereshit. So I'm gonna try to help you see Genesis from a different paradigm. And along the way, I'm sure that there'll be lots of questions, and that's okay, because when I teach my graduate students, they always have lots of questions. So this isn't like you didn't come to a lecture. Hopefully you came to a dialogue. The very fact that we sit like this is Greek enough. We would prefer, of course, for everyone to sit around in a circle so you can see the face instead of the back of somebody's head, and then you can see all their reactions. I'm the only one who gets to see all the emotional reactions when people go, "Oh, you can't mean that," right? So I'll do you all a favor by doing exactly what I do with my graduate students, most of whom are pastors because I teach at a seminary, right? I'm sure that you all knew pastors who always complained about everybody sitting in the back of the room, but let me tell you, when they come to a class, they all sit in the back. So I always call on the people in the very back of the room. So I'm sorry, what's your name back there, sir? You? Joe. Okay, so Joe, you're going to get the questions tonight. If you would like not to have the questions, then you need to move to the front, because I won't call anybody up here. Okay. So there'll be plenty of opportunity for dialogue, I hope, and some ideas that you'll get a chance to sort of think about together. That's the whole purpose, is a dialogue that causes you to think about things a little differently, and hopefully that gives you some incentive to go back and look at the text again and say to yourself, "Gee, I didn't ever see it like that. I wonder what it would mean if this and this and this." And that's basically what we really need to do, because we need to unhook the paradigm that we all grew up with. Unless there's somebody here from an ancient Near Eastern Semitic background, probably most of us grew up in a Western idea. And as a result, we have assumptions that we carry along with us. A lot of those assumptions, by the way, we're not even aware of. They just become part of the way that we think the world works. And unfortunately, when we take those kinds of assumptions to exegesis, when we take them to the text and we start looking at the text, because we're blind to the assumptions that we have, we don't understand why it is that we think the way that we do. We often read the text from that perspective, and it takes somebody to come along and sort of, give us a little kick and say, "Okay, well, wait a minute, what if we looked at it like this?" So that's what we'll try to do. And that means that if you have a question, please raise your hand, so then I can say, "Okay, well, that was a stupid question." So, no, I won't do that. All questions are good questions. If they are really going to take us down a rabbit trail, though, I'll probably ask you to defer the question until I'm awake. And so, in the meantime, if you have a question that's related to what I'm trying to talk about, please just say, "Hey, I have a question." And then John will run around with the microphone so everybody can hear what you have to say. And we'll turn all the cameras toward you so that everyone around the world can see what a stupid question it really was. And the reason I'm hanging on to these is because I have a bunch of books out there, which some of you are familiar with some of my books. Guardian Angel has sold a lot and makes a big difference on how you read the Genesis text. But these I'm hanging on to because they were lectures I did in London on paradigms, and they don't exist anywhere except in my hand. I brought these, they're the only ones. So if you're interested in those afterwards, well, we can talk about those. It's about 6 or 7 hours of stuff about paradigms and how they work. Okay, so let's take a look at the Genesis account. So we need a change of venue here. Slide, please. The Genesis of Genesis. And you notice that it's subtitled Kingdom Re-Education. And the reason for that is because Genesis, of course, like all of the other documents that make up our Bible, both the apostolic documents and the Tanakh, all of those were written to audiences that heard the words according to what they understood the words to mean. And our job, of course, is to figure out what those audiences understood from the author's original intention. In other words, you can write this down. Joe, you can write this down. The Bible was not written for me. Right? Shock of all shocks. It wasn't written for you. It was written for people who lived thousands of years ago in different circumstances, with different history, with different culture, with different language. And one of the jobs that we have as exegetes today, as trying to understand what the text says, is to see how well we can figure out what it meant to the original audience. So the first principle of exegesis is, what did it mean to the people who heard it the first time? Right? What were the meanings of the words to the people of the original audience? And presto changeo, lo and behold, Genesis wasn't written to Isaac Newton, and it wasn't written to Darwin, and it certainly wasn't written to the current crop of atheists. Genesis was written to whom? It was written to the Hebrews when? When they were in Sinai, in the desert, right? I mean, in other words, when they come out of Egypt, they may have had, and they probably did have, oral stories and folklore and that kind of stuff that went along with them. But the text, if it was compiled by Moses and delivered to the people of Moses, was delivered to an audience that came out of Egypt, right? So how long were they in Egypt? Long time, longer than we've been in the United States. So that means that they absorbed the culture of Egypt and the language that Moses uses to talk to those people is filled with Egyptian ideas that God then takes and sort of redefines. Because there's no point in talking to a people in a language they don't understand, right? I mean, even if I use the same language, but the words are completely different, you won't understand what I'm saying, right? So has anybody here ever read Chaucer, for example? Right? Chaucer writes in English. You can't understand anything he's saying. It's Old English. Have you ever? And we don't have to go back that far. Try reading one of the original English translations. Try reading the King James in its King James English, and you'll see how difficult it is to try to figure out what all those words really mean. So imagine trying to communicate a message from God that doesn't use the common parlance of the audience that you're speaking to, which means that when we read Genesis, especially since we're reading Genesis in translation, for heaven's sake, we have to go from whatever the Hebrew meaning of the word was in the Egyptian time period to the meaning in the Masoretic text to the meaning that the translators took it to mean, or maybe we look at the Greek in between, but by the time we're done, we're that far away from what the real meaning was, right? So one of the things that we have to do is keep backing up and asking ourselves, well, wait a minute, if you were in the desert in Sinai and Moses was trying to tell you about your history, your heroes, your background, God's purposes, who God is like, what he wants from you, it has to communicate in words that you would understand. And a lot of those words, as we will discover, have Egyptian characteristics. Okay? So let's look at the next slide. The problem with this is, can I move forward a few steps? I'll be okay. Because the problem with this is I need to look at the slides too. So I have to learn as well. So here's what happens. What happens when one tribe, one ethnic group falls under the oppression and the domination of another ethnic group? And we don't have to go very far to answer that question, do we? My parents came from Poland and from Norway, right? When my father went to school, he didn't speak English. He spoke Norwegian. And he went to school in Idaho, and he had to learn English in school because in the house, they spoke Norwegian. What about you? I'm sure that if you went back just 1 or 2 generations, you would be someplace in Europe, someplace in Eastern Europe or Western Europe, someplace in Asia. So you would have come from somewhere, right? But guess what? When you come here, what happens? You get assimilated. That's right. Now, one of the problems today is that we have now decided that it's a benefit to everyone not to assimilate. Right. I'm not so sure that makes a lot of sense, because in the history of the world, the lack of assimilation always led to fragmentation. Okay? And we can talk about the history of the world if you want sometime. But today we're only going to talk about Genesis. So when we put those people, a very small tribe, right, a small group of people go down to Egypt and they start to live there. And guess what? Over time they assimilate, don't they? And in fact, the issue with the golden calf is a perfect example of assimilation, isn't it? It isn't that. I mean, we're going to talk about the golden calf if we get that far, but the whole point of the golden calf is that they're not making an idol so they can worship idols. They're trying to worship Yahweh, but the form of worship that they use comes from Egypt because they've assimilated it. And in fact, they've assimilated so much that basically Yahweh has to decide after 40 years, it's not going to work. I'm going to have to start over with another generation. In other words, they're so assimilated into Egypt, into Egyptian way of thinking, that it takes a whole generation to come out of it. That, by the way, ought to give us a fair warning of what we're facing. But then nevertheless, the problem is, the more assimilation that happened, the more they became like Egyptians in their thinking. And that's a paradigm shift. What's happening with the Hebrews is that they're shifting. They're shifting in their deepest thoughts. And when they do that, things happen to cultures when they assimilate. So one of the things that happen is that they start to lose their individual identity. That loss of identity means that they need to be re-educated, right? It isn't like look, when Moses shows up and they say, well, who sent you? They have a pretty good idea when he starts talking about Yahweh, who Yod-Heh-Vah-Heh is, right? But that doesn't mean that they have not assimilated other ideas around that. They've sort of, added things to the fringe. And in fact, some of their ideas actually radically changed over time, because now they're 4, 5, 6 generations into being assimilated into Egypt, and they start thinking like Egyptians, okay? So that means that the loss of their land, their language, their independence ultimately always results in cultural assimilation. It means that you start to act like the culture that you live in. And the Genesis Exodus story, and it's one story, by the way, there's no separation. I mean, we have it today because we've added all this stuff, but there's no separation in the Tanakh between the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus, right? It just goes from Bereshit to Shemot, right? These are the names, right? So we have one continuous story, and that story, by the way, embraces some really, really important things that you need to know if you're a tribe that's been assimilated, right? So God has to come into the picture now and say, okay, wait a minute. You've had a lot of time thinking about the world in terms of Egyptian ideas, and now I want to re-educate you. I want to start to re-educate you about the things that really matter. And so we're going to look at how God does that in Genesis. And I think it'll settle some other issues, some issues about reading the Genesis account as though it were about the scientific, as though it were just naive science, right? It's just really about the Big Bang Theory, but it's put in religious terms. No, I don't think so. I think what's happening is, if we understand the original audience, we'll have to ask ourselves, okay, if you're the original audience and now you're going to pretend that you're the original audience and you've come out of Egypt, what are the things that you really have to know? So let's look at the next slide. So, a tribe. This is from Jonathan Sacks, who was the chief rabbi of Great Britain, in a really interesting book. He says, tribalism has an immense power to surrender the lonely self to something larger, more powerful, more elemental is one of the deepest instincts of mankind. And a tribal world is antagonistic, a place where conflict, where the strongest wins and honor and glory and fighting, even dying happens. And if you think about our Western world, you recognize exactly what he's talking about. Because if you think about how the West came into being, you'll remember the legends from Homer, right? Remember Troy, Achilles, and Hector, and all the battles and fighting. What was all that about? Why do we even, well, maybe you don't, but for my children, why do I want them to understand Greek mythology? Because Greek mythology provides the foundation, the lowest layer of understanding the world from a Western perspective. In other words, it tells me what it means to be a hero. It tells me what it means to die. It tells me what it means to live. Those kinds of legends aren't just stories that show up in a movie with Brad Pitt. They're actually about how we think about the world. And if we had time, I would take you through a whole bunch of scenes from Troy, and you could see how much of the reality that we believe is true today of the world is really found in the legends of Homer, right? Not surprisingly, the Greek philosophers pick up some of that stuff, and it becomes part of the way that we understand how the world works. And I just give you one small example, an example that's fundamental to the way that you think the world works from the West, but isn't the way that some other cultures think the world works, okay? And that example is the law of cause and effect, right? You think that every effect must have a cause. In fact, if I went to you, if tonight we decided we're going to take up an offering for cancer research, and then I tell you, but the problem is cancer doesn't have any cause. It just happens. There's no cause. You would think I was crazy, because why would you spend all that money trying to figure out why cancer happens if it doesn't have a cause? So in the West, we always think that every event, every effect has a cause, and here's the critical issue, if we understand the relationship between cause and effect, we can control and predict what's going to happen. Look, why do we do all the analysis in the stock market, for heaven's sake? So that we can be wrong 90% of the time. No, because we want to control and predict. The whole idea is we have a fundamental belief about the world that it is open to rational investigation, and that if we understand the causes and the effects, we can control and predict. That's what our life is built on, right? All of our technology is built on that sort of Greek analysis. You just have to know how things work. And that might be true of a cell phone, but it's much more difficult for human behavior. Because there's another cultural view, the view of the East, which says that the world is so complex and there are so many different influences on human behavior that you literally can't predict it. In fact, there's a great Chinese proverb that says, prediction is very difficult, especially when it's about the future, right? Because the world is so complicated. And by the way, it isn't just the world, because in that model, spiritual influences that you can neither observe nor understand have impact on behavior in this world. But we don't consider that when we think about the stock market prediction models. We don't think about that when we call up Merrill Lynch and scream because the market dropped 2,000 points in the last month. We don't say, help, help, help. What was the alignment of the moon and Jupiter, right? We don't believe the alignment of the moon and Jupiter has anything to do with the stock market, because we have this simple view that if we understand cause and effect, they're rationally controllable. Well, guess what? The Egyptians didn't have that view, and neither did the Hebrews, right? But we do. So when we start to analyze what's happening in the text, we have to remember that even the most fundamental building blocks of the way that we look at the Western world often is culturally dependent, right? It's not necessarily true just because you believe it, right? In fact, I have a really good friend, Bob Gorlick. He and I go to Israel quite often, twice this year, to take groups and help them understand what's happening in Israel in ancient times and in modern times. And one of the things that Bob always says is that the biggest roadblock for you to learn anything is what you think you already know. Right? That stands in the way. So today we're going to try to help you get a hold of what you think you already know so that we can sort of untangle it, and you can start thinking about what's happening in the Genesis text a little differently. Okay? So let's look at the next slide. So now it says, what makes a kingdom? Well, why would I even want to ask a question about what makes a kingdom when it comes to Genesis? I mean, come on. If I want to ask about the kingdom, I need the conversation with Pilate and Yeshua, right? For this purpose I've come into the world. What is the kingdom about? You called me a king. Why would I raise a question about kingdom when it comes to the Genesis account? Joe. Why would I raise a question about kingdom? What is God doing when he brings the people out of Exodus? He's establishing a kingdom, right? In other words, they have been under the kingdom of Pharaoh. Pharaoh was their suzerain lord, right? He's the one who determined how people live. He's the head, you're the citizen. You do what he says, okay? God takes his people out of that in order to what? In order to have them wander around the desert? No, in order to establish a kingdom, right? Well, a kingdom depends on some really important things. Oh, it disappeared. A kingdom depends on stories, right? Legends, history, heroes, stories that build a community because they answer fundamental things about what it means to be a part of the kingdom. And one of those fundamental things is to explain who we are. Why are we here? Why are we different, right? What makes us unique? And by the way, we have those kinds of stories in America. I mean, we don't think of it in terms of a kingdom, but we have those stories, don't we? Why do we celebrate 4th of July? It's just another day. Go to Canada, they don't celebrate 4th of July. Go to Britain, they don't celebrate 4th of July. And guess what? We don't have Boxer Day, or Boxing Day or whatever it is, right? What was the name of the holiday where the guy tried to blow up Parliament? Guy Fawkes. I love Guy Fawkes Day. Because it's better than fireworks. He was using real stuff, right? Okay. So, but we don't have a Guy Fawkes Day. Why? Because it's not part of our kingdom. Our kingdom stories are culturally dependent, aren't they? So we have revolutionary stories, we have independence stories, we have Liberty Bell stories. Guess what? The Hebrews are coming out of Egypt. They have Egypt stories. But God doesn't want a culture that's built on Egypt mythology and cosmology, so he has to give them stories that will build a new kind of platform so that they have different kind of heroes, different kinds of thinking about their destiny, their purpose, who God is, all that kind of stuff. And where does that start? It starts with who God is. In the beginning, God created, right? Why is that so fundamental to the Hebrews? Didn't they already know? Oh yeah, of course in the beginning God created. Who else would have created, right? Of course God did that. That's what the text says, right? But the point is, if I have to say that in the text, it must be in contrast to something else. So what was the something else it was in contrast to? Did the other competing mythologies of the ancient world claim that there were gods who created? Yes, of course, right. What was the difference between the way that the Genesis account talks about creation and the way that, say, the Babylonian account talks about it or the Egyptian account talks about it? Because they all talk about it. Every culture has a story about how everything started. What would be the point of having a culture that never had a beginning? You have to have a beginning. So every culture has a story about how things begin, right? Because of the Hebrew culture, we who are now part of the Judeo-Christian West, have adopted, for the most part, until we got to guys like Darwin, have adopted, for the most part, the idea that the Judeo version of creation was the truth. So we've adopted that story. But when that story was first written to the audience that heard it the first time, there were other stories. Do you know what some of those other stories were? How did the world come into creation in the Babylonian mythology? Well, most creation stories are related to human activity, right? I mean, how else would you think about creation? Creation happens in the way that you create things, right? And in most creation mythologies, creation occurs either through violence or sex. What else is there in life? right? You either fight or you make love. That's it. So, in the Babylonian mythology, it's about fighting. Marduk and Tiamat. Tiamat is of course, evil female. And Marduk is the glorious, wonderful male. And what does he do in order to create the universe? He has to slice the evil female in half. One half becomes the heavens, the other half becomes the earth, right? Aren't we glad that Marduk was so powerful that he could slice up Tiamat and create the heavens and the earth? But notice that the Babylonian mythology is a violent solution, right? You could expect that, couldn't you? In a culture that's about war, you win by conquering. So there's violence involved, right? What about the Egyptian mythology? Is the Egyptian mythology about violence? No, it's about something else. What else is there in life besides violence? Sex. Right? So the Egyptian mythology, look, if you're building a story, you have to build on some kind of analogy, and most humans either create with violence, they destroy something to create something else, or they create through love, right? And so the Egyptian mythology comes from love. Now, why is the Hebrew mythology so different? Guess what? God doesn't create through violence, and he doesn't create through sex. He speaks, and it becomes. Now, there are ancient mythologies that also talk about the word of God, or the word of the gods, creating. But when we go look at the picture of what they create, we're going to see that the Hebrew account is also very different. But the point is this: at the beginning, God takes an idea, where did the world come from, and creates a new thought about it that would be different than the cultures that the Hebrews are coming out of, right? In other words, he doesn't say to them, we don't even have to worry about that, just do what I say. No, he provides a story to show them that from the very beginning, his speaking, his gentle persuasion, his decision of will was enough to bring everything into existence. That's a very different kind of God. Right from the very start, a very different kind of God. Okay? So those stories help reform, re-educate the population that's coming out of Egypt, because they have mythologies, they have creation stories, they're just not like those. Okay? And we're going to see that there's lots and lots of them that have changed, but the language is something that they would understand. Okay? Let's try the next one. Okay, so what's the role of tribal mythology? And these are important points. Tribal mythology has to tell us who we are. Okay? Now think about the Genesis account as we go through these steps. It first has to tell us who we are, right? So does Genesis tell the Hebrews who they are? You bet it does. That whole long history up to Abraham, and then the choice of Abraham and all the history after that tells me who I am, right? Why we are. Now that's really important, because what's the point of having a tribal foundation that doesn't tell me why I'm here, what I'm supposed to do, what's my purpose, why we are? And God, in the Genesis account, tells his people why they're there. In fact, in the Exodus story, he makes it specifically clear why he chooses these people. Do you remember what he says? I'm going to do something. I'm going to make you into what? A holy nation, and that we can use the word kingdom there. A holy kingdom, so it's going to be set aside from all other kingdoms. And what else? A royal priesthood. But wait a minute. There were priests floating around in all these cultures. The Egyptians had priests, the Babylonians had priests, the Canaanites had priests. What makes the priesthood of Israel different? Why? God uses the same words. Everybody knows what a priest is. What does a priest do? What's the role of a priest? To what? To serve. No, a priest is an intermediary, right? An intermediary between what? Between man and God. In fact, the Levitical priests actually aren't intermediaries between God and man. They actually just serve. So you were also right. They just serve God. But the role of a priest in general in cultures is to act as an intermediary between God and man. Okay? Now that works really good for the Levites because God makes them his priests, right? But how come God says, I'm going to make you, all of you, a whole nation, a holy nation, I'm going to make all of you a royal priesthood? How does that work? Right? They're not priests to each other. A priest isn't an intermediary for another priest. So what is the purpose that God has in mind for telling the Israelites at Sinai that I'm now going to make you into a holy nation and a royal priesthood? Between God and who? Who are they supposed to be the intermediaries for? The other nations, right? So the whole idea is God saying, hey, you know why you exist? You exist because you're supposed to act as the intermediary between me and the other nations. It seems to me that Yeshua said something about that. Didn't he talk about being a light, a city on the hill, all those kinds of things? What was that all about? Do you think that was all about, I need to get all the Jewish guys to, convert? I don't think so. What he's saying is, don't you understand the original calling that God had in mind? The original calling was what? That you, the chosen people, are supposed to be the intermediaries between God and the nations. And in fact, God even says, if you live according to my commandments, you're going to be blessed. And what's going to happen? After you're blessed, I'll give you tracts and you can hand them out to all of the... Is that what he says? No, what does he say? He says the Gentiles are going to look at you and they're going to say, what's happening over there? My goodness, these guys, they only need 2 grapes to make a bottle of wine. For heaven's sake, we got to find out about this place. You see, what God has in mind is when they live according to his commandments, they will look so different than the rest of the nations that what will the nations do? The nations will come to them and say, tell us about your God. Right? Tell us about your God. How come you get treated like that? Now, it's interesting that they didn't fulfill that part of the commandment, but that doesn't mean that God didn't continue to use them as intercessors. And in fact, he does it in a strikingly different way. And I'll give you a little story and you'll figure it out right away. What is more likely to be a magnetic attraction to God? For you to be blessed and prosperous and drive your new Lamborghini and have extra rolls in the garage and live in a mansion, right? Or for you to have a deep sense of hope and faith in spite of suffering, right? Which model is going to give the most attraction? Well, of course, the first one's really good. I mean, the prosperity gospel guys have got that one down, right? And the whole point is, it is attractive to think that if I just get my act together and line up with God, he's going to bless me with lots and lots of good stuff. But the more attractive, the more magnetic is to see a person who has joy in the midst of chaos, who still has faith in powerful examples of suffering, who, by the way, and this really came home to me when I was in Jerusalem. I went to Yad Vashem. Do you know what Yad Vashem is? Okay, Yad Vashem is the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, right? And after I walked through, I just sat on the floor and cried, right? Because, it hit me really hard, but what really hit me is right behind me was a group of German tourists going through the Yad Vashem. And I cried because I realized that Israel's ability to forgive was beyond anything I could imagine. The fact that there were German tourists going through Yad Vashem spoke enormously about their faith in God, way beyond I could have imagined, right? And that is a magnetic attraction. So I think that what happened is this. God said, listen, if you want to do it the right way, we'll be blessed. The nations will come. But you're going to act as the intercessor anyway. Because even if you don't follow the commandments, I'm still going to use you. Only now you will be the attraction through suffering. And people will see that you haven't let go of your faith in spite of all these things that have happened. And that will become the attraction. Okay? So, at the very beginning, we need stories. And we need stories of the ability of the nations to see in the lives of those men and women that God chooses something that they desire, and they want it, and so they come to him. And by the way, that's probably why Abraham is considered the father of hospitality, because people who came to him, he showed them something that they desired. He went to bat for Sodom and Gomorrah. He argued on their behalf. He does the kinds of things that make us realize, my goodness, Abraham has a faith deeper than mine. What is it about Abraham's life that attracts me? It's that closeness to God. Now, does that mean Abraham ends up being a Greek hero so that nothing ever bad happens to him? Of course not. He's just an ordinary guy like me or like you. But there's something about him that story captures that makes me want to be like him. And so consequently, God uses that to build a foundation for these people coming out of Egypt. Because when you come out of Egypt, you feel pretty bad about yourself. You've been a slave for a long time. You have no idea what your real purpose in life is except to make bricks without straw, right? Okay, so let's go back to that slide. So what else? Our place in the universe. You need to know. And by the way, the big fad these days about learning your ancestry is just a symptom of this need to know stuff. I need to know how I belong, where I fit, right? So a tribal account must tell me in some fundamental way, some shared experience or some shared history, my place in the universe. And my argument in my book, Guardian Angel, which is all about the Genesis 1, 2, 3 account, is that story in Genesis 1, 2, 3 demonstrates the fundamentals of relationship and tells me how I fit into the universe, how I belong, okay? It has to tell me about the meanings of events around me. One of the things that the Genesis Exodus story has to tell me is why things happen the way that they do. Right? Why do things happen like that? Why is there a flood? Why do people die? Why do all these cultures spread all over the earth speak different languages? What happens when X, Y, Z, right? Think about all the stories in the Genesis account. Think about the relationship of Joseph and his brothers. Do you suppose that there isn't any other family in the world that ever had brothers who felt like that? Of course there are families like that. Right? Do you suppose that there's never been a family where the mother favored one child and the father favored another child? No, of course there's families like that. So the stories are real about us, but they provide foundation. They provide meaning. They explain to me why things happen the way that they do. And I need those kinds of stories in order to understand who I am. Okay, let's go back to that slide. It also has to tell us what we ought to want rather than what we want and how to get it. And that's ethical morality. That's the moral stories, right? In other words, I have to have stories in the Genesis account because I'm re-educating a tribe that tells me what it is that they should want, right? Not just what it is that you do want and how to get it. It's not a formula for success. It's a lesson in what it means to be ethical. And in Hebrew, we know that what it means to be ethical has both a vertical and a horizontal relationship, doesn't it? The vertical relationship is, how do I worship God? By the way, if you want to know how to worship God, who should you ask? God. I mean, I think he has a pretty good idea of how he wants to be worshiped, right? So that means I can't invent ways of worshiping, which is one of the mistakes of the golden calf. I don't get to invent ways. I have to listen to the way that he wants to be worshipped. That would be like me going in to see the king, and there's a protocol when you go see the king, right? And as I go in, I say, well, king, I know that there's a protocol, but I just thought I would make one up as I go along, right? That doesn't last very long. Ask Esther, right? Okay? So the whole point is I need a vertical story about what it means to worship properly. Where's the first account that I get of a vertical story about what it means to worship properly? Think about the Genesis stories. What's the first one that's about proper vertical worship? Cain and Abel. Wow, that's really early. Chapter 4. We just barely got started with the human race and already we're worried about vertical relationships, right? Yeah, there it is, right? Abel's sacrifice, Cain's sacrifice. Now, does the texts go on and tell me, and you know what? The problem with Cain's sacrifice is it didn't come with the 99.44% seal of approval. He didn't bring it in the right container. No, it doesn't say any of that, does it? It says one was accepted, one wasn't accepted. What does that tell me? There is an acceptable way. What do you know? It isn't just whatever I make up. There is an acceptable way. So the story, even though it doesn't give me the details, gives me something absolutely foundational to my relationship with God. There is a way that God wants. And if I know what it is, it's acceptable. And by the way, if I don't know what it is, what happens? Do you remember that story? Genesis 4, verse 7. We're going to have a real problem here. What do you think that's there for? Right? Genesis 4, verse 7 uses a word that only shows up in Scripture in 3 places. Right? It's the word, by the way, it's a word that gets mistranslated pretty much a lot, right? And there's a lot of scholarly debate about that word. And because it comes in the verse where it says, and sin crouches at the door, and it wants to overpower you, but you must resist it, okay? So, here's the point. When Cain doesn't present the sacrifice in the proper way, what happens? Does God immediately punish Cain? By the way, you didn't do it right. Right? Now go figure it out. Is that what he says? No, what does he say? And this is really important. He says, why is your face downfallen? Right? Just go make it right and come back. In other words, the assumption behind the story is Cain knew what to do. I wouldn't instruct him just go make it right and then come back unless I knew that he knew what to do, right? And the problem is, even though he knew what to do, he didn't do it. So the assumption of the story is both Cain and Abel knew the proper vertical relationship. One of them did it and one of them didn't, right? And God doesn't say to Cain, by the way, you failed, kicked out of class. What he says is go back and make it right and come back, right? Come back and it'll be fine. Go back and make it right. Okay? Now, Cain takes a different approach to the suggestion of God, but notice that the story is about the proper method of worship understood by the people who are expected to do it. Okay? Right? It's right there, very early on. So one of the things I have to know, what happened to my list, is what I ought to do. And by the way, it isn't just when it comes to worship, because there's the vertical and the horizontal. And what's the horizontal relationship all about? Everybody else, everything else, the earth, the animals, the people, everything else is on the horizontal relationship. And by the way, the Bible provides you with plenty of instruction about what to do with the horizontal relationship. And there are lots and lots of stories in the Genesis account that are instructions through the story, through the characters in the story, about what to do with the horizontal relationship. We often think of Torah as the legislative stuff, all the commands. But Torah, even Torah in a technical sense, is the entire first 5, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, which, by the way, most of it is narrative. There's poetry, there's singing, it's everything in there. It's all Torah, which means it's all there for you to learn from. You can learn as much from the story as you can from the legislation, right? The idea is you don't just pay attention to the commandments, you think about what's happening in the story, because you need those stories to know who you are, why you're here, where you came from, who God is, what your relationships are, right? You want to understand relationships? Read the story about Isaac, right? Isaac before, Isaac after. Read the story about Jacob. You want to understand relationships? Read the story about Jacob. Why does Jacob send... Well, Jacob's going to go back to see Esau. It's been a long time. Esau's very powerful. What is Jacob afraid of? That Esau's going to take revenge on him, right? A nice, common human emotion, right? Isn't it? This guy, you look what he did to me 40 years ago. I'm going to get even with him now, okay? So what does Jacob do? The typical human thing. What does he do? He sends gifts. Right? Every man knows this. You just send flowers. That helps. Right? If flowers don't work, then you send chocolates. If chocolates don't work, then you buy a new car, right? I mean, the price goes up, right? So he sends gifts. Gifts, gifts, gifts. Why is he sending gifts? Because he's trying to placate the potential revenge of his brother, okay? And then he does something really interesting. When they're getting closer and closer, and he knows that the horsemen are coming now, what does he do then? He sends his wives and his children. It's like, okay, look, if you're going to have to slaughter someone, I'll send the family out there first, right? And he ends up being the only one on that side of the brook, right? And lo and behold, somebody comes in the middle of the night. Somebody he wasn't expecting. But guess what? That's the only time that Jacob's been entirely alone without any of his manipulated defenses. He's sent them all away, and now he has no place else to go to put somebody between him and danger. And then he has his wrestling match. What a powerful story. What does that story tell you? If you were in the Hebrew tribe coming out of Egypt, what would you learn from that story? Do you suppose that you would learn that the real encounter that you're going to have with God has to come after you put everything else away? That the real wrestling with God, the wrestling that's going to give you a new name that will last forever, has to come after everything else is out of your life? Right? Think about how powerful that story is to shape how you think about your own existence, right? Those kinds of stories are so important to the way that we think about how the world works, how we're related to each other, how we're related to God, that they have to be fundamental to building a new culture. And so God uses those. Okay, let's try another one. Whoop. Blue. I can't think of a way that Moses talks about blue except maybe the red. No. Okay, so that's okay. While we're looking for blue, we'll think one more time about some of the other stories that come along, and let's start with a really, really old story, the story of Adam and Chava. Okay, now here's a really interesting story, because when you think about that story, there are two really big white elephants that never get mentioned in the text, but are fundamental to how the story works. And the first one, the first big white elephant, is the serpent. What's he doing in that story? Right? How in the world did he get there? I know God was looking the other way and he snuck under the gate. No, the whole point is the garden of delight is a garden where everything that's in the garden is there on purpose, with intention, and allowed by God to fulfill God's purposes. Okay? So that means that the serpent isn't accidental. The serpent plays a very important, critical part in what God is trying to do. Okay? That's a big white elephant, because we want to ask, how did the serpent get there? The second one we don't often ask, but it's just as big, and that is, why did God put the tree there in the first place? Wouldn't it have been so much nicer to just have the tree of life and leave the tree of the knowledge of good and evil outside the garden someplace, right? Wouldn't God have accomplished his purposes to have a holy nation, a royal priesthood, if he just hadn't put the tree there? Life would have been so much nicer. But the tree is there, which means that I need to learn something about why the serpent and the tree are there. Because they are there. They're part of the story. They make the story real. They make the story important. They make the story confrontational. Right? And maybe, just maybe, I couldn't be human without those pieces of the story. Maybe, from the perspective of those people coming out of Egypt, I have to have those characters, those elements in the story for it to make any sense to me. Okay? Let's back up, and now we're going to go all the way back. We talked about the first verse, right? Bereshit bara Elohim, right? In the beginning, God created. But what's the second verse? And this is where I want you to start thinking like an Egyptian or a Hebrew who's coming out of Egypt instead of thinking like Isaac Newton. Okay? So what's the second verse say? Okay, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And what? And the earth was without form, formless and void, tohu vavohu, right? And what else? And darkness was on the face of the deep, right? Okay, so now imagine yourself in Egypt. You've been in Egypt for as long as you can remember, and your parents as long as they can remember, and your grandparents, okay? Tell me the kinds of things that, from an Egyptian perspective, cause you the greatest dread and fear. Well, the first one, I can give you the clue. It's called tohu vavohu, formless and void. Because in Egyptian mythology, the entire universe has underneath it all a primal sea of chaos. And everything in the everything about the primal sea is trying to take over and bring chaos back into your life, right? The thing that you do all of your life is try to fight off the chaos. In fact, go on vacation for 3 or 4 weeks and do nothing at the house that you left behind and see how much chaos is there when you come home, right? But we did that one time, and when we came home, it was like, what smells so funny? We went around for a long time. We couldn't figure out what it was. And of course, mice fall inside the walls, and they die, and then your house stinks. And you're thinking to yourself, how'd that mouse get in there? And the answer is because there was no one home, right? Chaos got into my life because I was gone, right? So what happens in the Egyptian thinking is that everything is, underneath everything is chaos. And if I let it go, it will take over. It will submerge me. It will kill me because chaos wants to take over. Okay? So when I read the verse, and the world and the earth was formless and void, that is 100% Egyptian thinking. Because anybody who came out of Egypt would know that chaos was the biggest enemy that you could ever have. Great, God created the heavens and the earth. So what? There's still chaos. What does God do with chaos? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Wonderful. What happens to chaos? The earth was formless and void. And what was on the face of the deep? Darkness. But you see, we live in an electric light world. What happens when you live in Egypt in darkness? Chaos. Because things happen in the dark that you can't control. Things happen in the dark that you're afraid of. Things happen in the dark that you don't anticipate. In fact, anything can happen to you in the dark. And when it's really dark and you can't see your hand in front of your face, bad things can really happen. Okay? When I was a kid, a long time ago, I went to a place called Lava River Cave State Park. It's in Oregon someplace. Right? Have you been there? Yeah. So you go down in this, it's a volcanic tube that lava used to flow through, and now it's a big cave, right? And you go down into this cave, and you go with a guide, and fortunately he has a light. And then you get into the cave someplace, like half a mile or so, and he says, okay, now stand still, don't move at all. I'm going to shut off the light. And I'm going to tell you, that is dark. You can't see anything. You can't see this right here. You can't see it. There is no light at all. And you realize that if you move, anything can happen to you, right? So, darkness was on the face of the deep. The most scary word you could ever hear as an Egyptian or a Hebrew coming out of an Egyptian culture was that chaos was there, and it was so dark you couldn't see anything. In fact, anything could happen to you. Okay? What is the Egyptian answer to anything can happen to you? Do you know about the Egyptian mythology? You will learn about the Egyptian mythology when we see the picture of the Egyptian mythology. But here's what God says, and you can contrast it. What does God do to overcome this terrible, awful, fearful darkness where chaos is running rampant and anything can happen to you? What does God do? Wait, you jumped too far forward. We are only doing one word at a time. Okay? What does the verse say? And the earth was formless and void, and darkness on the face of the deep, and what? And the Ruach HaKodesh, the Spirit, the Ruach grabbed a flaming sword and fought the chaos back and smashed it, bottled it up, and sold it. What? No? What does it say? Hovered. What's the verb? It's like the mother hen over her chicks, right? Hovered over the... Oh, so how does God defeat chaos? With violence? With force? How does he defeat chaos? By mothering it. By mothering it. In other words, chaos is no threat to me at all. Darkness isn't any threat to me at all because God can deal with it as simply as a mother hen spreading her wings over her chicks. Am I afraid of that? No. But if I were coming out of Egypt, those words would scare me to death. And now I have a God for whom the most scary thing in my entire world is nothing more than a mother hen spreading her wings over her chicks. That's powerful, powerful stuff. And it happens in the second verse, right? Yeah, that's right. And he says, Vahi or, Yavahi or. So now he creates light. But the point is he dealt with chaos already. He dealt with chaos before he had light. He didn't need light to dispel chaos. He literally loved chaos into obedience. Right? Pretty cool. Pretty cool. Okay, let's go back to, can we go back to the slide now? Okay, we're going to go back. So, I need to know who I am, why I'm here, what difference it makes for me to be here, right? And, of course, I need to know, why do people die? Does the Genesis story tell me about death? It's a very interesting story, isn't it? So let's pretend that you're Adam and Eve. There's a lot of Adam and Eves in here, so we'll have to just pretend that only one of you is Adam and the other one's Eve, okay? And God comes along and he gives Adam a commandment. By the way, he doesn't give the commandment to Eve, does he? Hava is really her name. I don't like to use Eve, so if it's okay with you, we'll call her Hava, or it's her Hebrew name, okay? And by the way, it's a Hebrew name that she didn't invent, and neither did God. The Hebrew name comes from Adam, and there's a reason for that. And if you really want to find out how powerful that is, you can read the book Guardian Angel, okay? So Adam gets the command, right? And the commandment given to Adam is a dietary commandment. Isn't it interesting that God's first commandment is about what not to eat? We still haven't learned that one, okay? So, it's a dietary commandment, really simple. Why does God give it? And this is important for tribal culture too. Why does God give a dietary commandment? Why doesn't he give a commandment about worship? You will only worship me on the 6th day of the 7th month of the 5th year at the waterfall next to the big rock. Why doesn't he say that? Why does he give a dietary commandment? What is there about a dietary commandment that's so important? You have to eat to survive. So he gives you a commandment about what is absolutely necessary in your life. Okay? And so then you say to yourself, yep, I can eat once. Is that the way it works? No, you have to eat constantly. You have to eat over and over and over. And the reason that the dietary commandment is the fundamental commandment is because it teaches you two things: absolute dependence and constant reminder, right? There's no point in giving a commandment about an event that only occurs one time in your life. God gives you a commandment. He gives Adam the commandment that constantly reminds Adam of his dependence on God and that is absolutely necessary for his survival, right? That tells you something really important about the commandments, doesn't it? It's in the first one. Why isn't it in the rest of them? All the rest of the commandments are built on that same foundation. Absolutely essential to survive and something that reminds me of my dependence on God every time, right? So, Adam gets the commandment. Gee, what were we talking about? We were talking about death. We're talking about death. So Adam gets the commandment, right? Here's the commandment. Of all the trees and fruits in the Garden of Eden, in the garden, you may eat, freely eat. In fact, it says, akal tokel, you may eat. You can stuff yourself, right? You can gorge on all this stuff. Have a great time. Enjoy the feast. But of this particular fruit, you may not eat of it, because in the day that you eat of it, you will mut. You will surely die. You will die. Okay? Ask yourself this. Does Adam have any idea what God's talking about? No, he doesn't, does he? He has no idea. He's never seen death. He has no idea. God might as well say, in the day that you eat of it, you will surely laugh, joke. You will surely subway. In the day that you eat of it, you will surely subway. It doesn't mean anything to Adam. The idea of death has never been present in the creation. So Adam can't possibly understand what the commandment is about. Who was the commandment written for? The children of Israel. They know what death means. So the story means something to them that it couldn't mean to Adam. Isn't that interesting? The story wasn't written for Adam. It was written for the children of Israel. They're very familiar with death. And by the way, take one more step and recognize what the prime directive is that God gives. What is the prime directive? Right? He says, let's make man in our own image, let them rule over the field, and all that stuff, right? And then he says, and let them do what? Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. What else? Subdue. What do they have to subdue in the garden? Everything works perfectly. There's nothing to subdue, right? But the word is there. Why? Because the story was written to people who understand what subdue means. The same people who understand what death means. In other words, the story wasn't written for the people in the garden. The story was written for the people who came out of Egypt so that they would identify what was happening in the garden, and it would make sense to them then, when they're standing there after 400 years of captivity. They know what death is. They know what subdue is. They know what hardship is. They know what suffering is. And those words make sense to them, even if they don't make any sense in the context of Adam and Chava alone. Right? Yes?
Good question. When he says that he puts man there to work it, how does work and subdue? Is that same kind of story?
Yeah, and what's interesting about the word work there is, you know the verb, right? Okay, in Hebrew, the word for work there is avad. We get avada, the pirkei avodah, the works of the fathers, okay? The word for avad doesn't mean just work. And I'm glad you didn't have it translated, there was no man to till the field, right? It's to work the field. But the word means also to serve. And it's used in the context of worship. So it means to serve, to work, and to worship all at the same time. Which means that if I understand properly what God did, He created the man and put him in the garden to do work, worship, and service all at the same time. And that tells me something really, really important about the Hebraic idea of work. The Hebraic idea of work is not the same as the idea of toil. Right? Toil is what happens after the disobedience. Before the disobedience, work is to be the perfect combination of service and worship and effort. Right? So, guess what I'm trying to do with my life? I want my life to be the perfect combination of my efforts, which delight others, serve, and worship God at the same time. Right? And anything other than that is probably going to be a variation of toil, because then I realize I'm not working for delighting others and serving and worshiping God and fulfilling my purpose at the same time. I'm doing something else. I'm earning money so I can go on vacation. And then I'll feel like I'm, worshiping and serving, right? But that doesn't work in the Hebrew world, because in the Hebrew world, my purpose should be intimately connected with my effort, my delighting others, blessing others, and my worship all at once. So I don't worship on Shabbat, I worship all the time. It's just that I perform different kinds of actions on Shabbat, right? Okay, so that's a very early story, isn't it? Second chapter of Genesis. It says, and there was no plant on the earth. Why? Because God had not given the rain and there was no man to work the field. But that's interesting too, isn't it? Because that tells me that in order to be productive, I need what God does and I need what I do. In other words, there wasn't any plant on the earth because God didn't give rain, period. Wrong. Because God didn't give the rain, something that only God can do, and there was no man to work the field, something that only I can do. So right away in that story, I learned that my restoration of the earth comes about through a cooperative effort between man and God. One of the things that I have to learn from that story is I'm in a partnership with God to restore the earth. Oh, and this is a really other interesting thing about that little story. So God puts man in the garden. And then he says, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, replenish, right? The only words that make sense to the people coming out of Egypt. But notice the scope of the prime directive, right? Does this make any sense? He says to Adam and Chava, multiply, fill the earth, right? Replenish, subdue, right? Does that make any sense? Not if they're going to stay in the garden. Unless it's a very big garden, they are soon going to run into the limits of the garden. So what's the intention of the prime directive? To expand the garden to the size of the globe. In other words, your job is to make the garden bigger. It's not to run off to the garden and close the gate so no bad serpents can get in there. Your job is to make the garden as big as the globe. And in fact, in the Genesis account, we learn that one of the things that God intends you to do is to get to work, making the earth in the same form that the garden was. And Heschel says something really interesting about this. What he says is that God left the creation incomplete, so you would have a job to do. Right? Because that's what the story implies. That God deliberately didn't finish the job so that we would have something to do. Right? Very interesting. Okay, so are we back? So death. So why do we die? It says, if you sin, you die. So there's the explanation of what death, the purpose of death is, or what happened with death. But it doesn't make any sense to Adam because he doesn't know. So it can only mean something to the Egyptians, and they know. And now they know that death is connected to sin. Okay? But I just came out of Egypt. What is death connected to in Egypt? Disobedience? If I disobey the Pharaoh, he's going to kill me. But what about on the spiritual level? Thank you very much. If you read Mircea Eliade's book, The Myth of Eternal Return, you will discover that death is just one step in the return, the endless cycle of going around and around and around. So death is just the beginning of another life. And now we're back to Disney. The Tree of Life. Or what is that what it's called? The circle of life, right. So somebody dies and somebody's born. Somebody dies and somebody's born. You die and somebody else is born. And when they die, maybe you'll be born again. And you just go around and around and around. So in the ancient Near Eastern ideas of the myth of eternal return, death is not a consequence to disobedience. Death is a natural process of reincarnation. It just goes around and around and around. And by the way, in the Egyptian thinking, death in the next life is just like death in this life. That's why when the Pharaoh goes into the grave in the pyramid, he takes his wife, his children, his animals, his slaves, plenty of food, lots of wine. You know, he needs all that stuff because the next life, he's going to enjoy all that. And when that's over, he'll come back again in the form of another little boy who'll become the next Pharaoh, right? So that God radically changes that idea. And now death has permanent consequences. It isn't just one more, spin around the circle, right? So something happens in the story that people understand from the Egyptian mythology. There's this problem with death. It's a big problem. But in the Egyptian mythology, it's just one more move around the circle. And when it comes to the Bible, it is a permanent issue. There's nothing that says Adam's going to come back. Hava's going to come back. Right? It takes a long time for reincarnation to become part of Jewish thinking. Basically, it takes until 400 AD. 400 BCE. Right? By the time Hellenism impacts Judaism, reincarnation shows up again. But it's not part of the Tanakh. You can't find it there. Okay? So, next one. Decision. Why should I live this way? And think about the stories in Genesis that help you realize why you should live that way. In fact, if you think about all the stories of the heroes of Genesis, you will see the progression over and over and over about how God teaches his people why they should live the way they do. Right? Joseph is a really good example. Why should I live the way Joseph lives? By the way, what's characteristic of Joseph's life? One word. I'm sorry? Suffering. No, not suffering. Joseph suffered a lot, but that's not the characteristic of his life. No, the characteristic of Joseph's life is contentment. You don't ever see Joseph arguing with God about why all these bad things happened to him. You don't ever see Joseph saying, Lord, I've been a good boy. Why are you treating me like this? In other words, Joseph learns contentment. He learns to accept what's happening, right? It doesn't mean that he likes it. He suffers. He suffers unjustly. We see all kinds of abuse. We see kinds of, the injustice of the world. Even Potiphar, who agrees that he's not guilty, still has to sentence him in order to keep his wife happy. We see all that. We don't ever see Joseph, except one time, saying anything about how God's mistreating him. Right? He's content. And in the end, what does that do? It provides him with a foundation for God to use him in spectacular ways, so that ultimately forgiveness does become one of his models. But the real story of Joseph is, you intended it for evil, but God intended it for good. That is, I believed all along that God was doing something that I couldn't see, but he was doing something with my life and I couldn't figure it out, and my job was to be content, to allow God's sovereign hand to do what he wanted with me. Right? Huge story, massive story, and critically important for people coming out of Egypt. Because what have they been saying for the last 200 years? God, why are you doing this to us? Right? And here comes the story of Joseph saying, you don't understand. What God is doing is beyond what you can see now. But what you think was intended for evil, he is using for good. Right? Important tribal stories. Okay, let's try another one. Another slide. So who am I? And Jonathan Sachs points out that question is answered by, to which narrative do I belong? Right? So I want you to think of your own tribal history. You belong to a narrative. There's some narrative about where you came from, what your people were like, what they did for work. You can think in the ancient world how connected this is to, my father was a carpenter, I'm a carpenter, right? My grandfather was a carpenter. We were all fishermen. All those connections that give you a narrative of who you are because of who you belong to. And now you understand why the Bible spends so much time on those endless genealogies. You can't even read half the names in there. Why do they even bother to put them in there? Right? Because it's this question they're answering. Who am I? I am the product of all of those people in that line, of the Father begetting the Son, who begets 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 me. In other words, I'm the summation of every relationship that occurred in that long chain, and guess what? I am going to add to that chain too. So I better make sure that my life stands up to the standard of all those people who came before me so I can pass it on to my children. That's tribal identity. That's who I am, right? In the Western world, we think of ourselves like this: independent, isolated, Robinson Crusoe fighting off the Indians in the wilderness. We think of ourselves as the rugged, you guys live in Oregon, come on. And John Wayne is probably the cultural hero, right? Yeah, I said to somebody the other day, we need a John Wayne in the White House now. But nevertheless, no political incorrectness from me. Right. Okay. So here's the point. We think, the reason that we think of individuality is because we grew up in a Western world where every man makes his own destiny. Right? Where being disconnected from 1,500 years of ancestry doesn't cause you deep emotional anguish. Right? Why? Because you can be independent, because you grab life by the horns, you make yourself, you're the self-made man, okay? That is not how the East thinks. The East thinks in terms of all of those relationships that went before that create me, and how responsible I am for all those relationships to pass them on to the next generation. Right? That's why I have to have the genealogies, because I need to know the history of God with everyone who came before me so that I can bear that weight to pass it to the ones who come after me. Right? I'm not independent. I'm a link in a very long chain. Okay? So, next. That means I need ritual, narrative, ceremony, and symbol to make these things real. Okay? You can understand the narrative because we've been talking about the stories. But what about the rituals? What rituals, what ceremonies, what symbols do I need? Don't you suppose that the Torah is filled with rituals and ceremonies and symbols? And every single one of those communicates meaning. It doesn't communicate meaning in words. Lots of times it communicates meaning in what we do, a ritual, right? And sometimes even in the symbols that we use. So we have a symbol right here. We have this symbol. This ram's horn. That's a symbol. It's also a ritual, right? It tells me something about my identity because only certain people blow ram's horns, right? I mean, not everybody in the world is running around blowing the shofar, right? That means that I have created an identity around that ritual, that sound, and that instrument, right? I created an identity for who I am. I belong to those crazy people who blow the shofar, right? I belong to the people who carry the Torah scrolls. I belong to the people who copy all those letters meticulously and count how many marks this way and how many marks that way. I belong to those people. And I need that sense of belonging in order to know who I am. Right? When I disconnect myself from the rituals, the symbols, the ceremonies, I lose my identity. I don't know who I am anymore. Right? And by the way, that happens in every culture. It's happening in our culture. The more we give up our symbols, our rituals, and our ceremonies, the less we have identity with the culture that we came from. In fact, Jonathan Sacks makes a really interesting comment when he says that a culture without priests is on the verge of losing its identity because the priests are the ones who maintain those borders in our lives, right? You can think about how difficult that was when Israel collapsed after the Romans in 72 AD. The priesthood had enormous problems. And what did they do? Abandon the priesthood? No. They shifted to a different way to maintain the same rituals and substituted temple worship with another ritual because they knew that that identity would keep them going. And in fact, one of the most important symbols and rituals in Israel is Shabbat. I mean, that symbol has kept them in a unique identity for thousands of years, right? They've been spread out all over the globe. They don't have a land. For a long time, didn't have a language, right? Except in the written form. They certainly lost their connection with all of the things that were happening in Israel, but they didn't lose their identity. Why? Because they carried the symbols and the rituals with them, right? So Genesis begins that process of building symbols and rituals into the culture. And you can see that. It's a Genesis Exodus story. You can see that really clearly in the Ten Commandments. right? The 10 words, okay? Did you know that the commandment, you shall not lie, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not bear false witness, all that. Did you know that all happens in about one sentence, right? Just bing, 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 bing. Why? Because God doesn't have to explain what those things mean. Everybody knows what it means, okay? How many sentences does it take God to explain what you're supposed to do on Shabbat? I mean, it goes on and on and on. It's supposed to involve your maidservants and your manservants and your animals, and you can't do this and you can't do that, and you're supposed to do this, and on and on. Why does God spend so much time, more than any other thing, more than even the commandments against idolatry? He spends so much time talking about Shabbat in the Ten Commandments. If you look at it, it's the massive part of the Ten Commandments. Why? Ask yourself, what was happening to the people who heard this? Had they been celebrating Shabbat? They'd been slaves for how many years? Do you think that Pharaoh said, oh, you guys work so hard, I'll just give you Shabbat off? No way. In fact, after hundreds of years of being a slave, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, I need to rebuild the distinctiveness of Shabbat because it hasn't been part of my practice so long that I've forgotten how it works. Right? So God spends all that time in that one commandment telling in exquisite detail exactly what it means. But when it comes to thou shalt not murder, 2 words, done. Because everybody knows what that means. Right? So when you think about the commandments, you think, oh, it's all, all this legislation. But no, it's cultural history. He's rebuilding their thinking as he goes along. Okay? Let's try another one. Transcendence. So transcendence is, who's God? And here's the biggest problem for all ancient Near Eastern cultures. The gods are very different than men. In fact, they're so different that there's no way to bridge the gap, right? The gods live in a different world, they enjoy different morality, they have different ideas, different feelings, and down here we just slave and work away, right? I mean, look, all the cultures had gods and men, but in almost all the cultures, except in the Hebrew culture, men were created for one purpose and one purpose only. What was that? Take a guess. To serve the gods. In other words, gods don't like to wash dishes. They don't like to take out garbage. They certainly don't clean toilets. Therefore, we need somebody to do that. Men. So we'll create men so that they have to do all those things, right? And I know you're shaking your head because you're thinking, yeah, that's right. My husband should be doing all that. No, you got that one wrong. In the ancient Near East, women aren't even created because they're so low down on the totem pole that they end up being nothing more than property, right? Except in Hebrew. Except in Hebrew, and this is really important as well. But let's stick with the men one right now, okay? So the gods create men to serve them, right? Now think about Genesis 1, 26 and 27 and tell me what the difference is. Oh, do I have to remind you what Genesis 1, 26 and 27 is about? And the Lord said, let us make man in our own image according to our likeness. Let him, what's the next verb? Rule. Rule. How many slaves do you know that rule? 0. So here are these people coming out of Egypt. They've been slaves for 300 years. Have they ever ruled? No. And what is the first thing God tells them about who they are and who He is? I made you to rule. That is joyous news to a slave. Because the slave is expecting the God to say, you no longer serve Pharaoh, now you serve me. You see that garbage? Take it out. Right? And God doesn't say that. God says, I made you to rule. Wow, that's dramatically different than anything they had ever heard in Egypt or in any other ancient Near Eastern culture. Okay? And just because men rule doesn't mean that women don't. Because in that verse it says, let us make man in our own image, Adam. And in the end of the verse it says, and he made them male and female. So the prime directive is given to both. They both rule. They're equal. That is revolutionary. Furthermore, in the Genesis 2 story, when we actually talk about the creation of the woman, the language is royal. It's the last thing God ever does, his magnum opus, right? The rabbis say that that a man without a woman diminishes the world, right? So the whole point is, and by the way, in no other ancient mythology is there any creation of woman at all. Hebrew is the only mythology that has the creation of woman, which means that God made a specific and deliberate point of putting that into the narrative so that all those women who had been treated like property in Egypt for centuries come out of Egypt, and they not only are equal, but they are the royal capstone of everything that God had done. That's really amazing stuff. Imagine that you are a woman coming out of Egypt. You and your family have been slaves forever, and you have been treated like cattle, right? And then you run across a God who not only rescues you from that, but tells you that you are a royal princess, designed specifically with a covenant with him that a man doesn't share. For the purpose of relationship management, you are the protector, provider, nourisher, and sustainer, right? You share the same functionality that he does, the Ezer, right? And by the way, you're the best thing he ever did. I mean, is there no woman not jumping up and down and shouting, yes, God, right? I mean, think about that. Yeah. And by the way, in that regard, the Christian church is Egyptian, because it didn't see that what God was doing there was radically different than any other ancient mythology, and it left the position of women for hundreds of years in the same role that they had in Egypt, which is not the Hebrew biblical role. So there's a story there in the second chapter of Genesis, which fundamentally alters the way that I think of myself and the way that I, as a man, think of myself in relation to a woman. By the way, there's another interesting, really very powerful verse there. You know, what's the Hebrew word for the man? Adam, right? Means the man Adam. It means Adam, mankind, okay? What is the Hebrew word that God gives to the woman? Ezer kenegdo, right? That I have a book out there. It's all about that, okay? What is the Hebrew word that the man gives to himself in the presence of the woman? Ish, okay? Because really interesting, you do not find Ish anywhere in the original account of the creation of man. You find Adam, 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 okay? But Adam himself changes the word from Adam to Ish when he says, she shall be called Isha because she comes from Ish. Okay? Now, Isha and Ish are not linguistically related. This is a word play in Hebrew. It doesn't mean that the two words come from the same etymological background. They don't. Okay? So that means that the words are used in the verse for another reason. And here's what I'm going to suggest to you. Adam renames his own identity because in her presence, he's someone else. He doesn't say, she shall be called woman because I am Adam. He says, she shall be called woman because I am man. And he uses a different Hebrew word than every other occurrence before or after that story. Right? In other words, in the very next verse, it goes right on saying, the man shall leave his father and mother, uses the word Adam. Right? But in that story, Adam changes his identity because of her. See? That's real love. That he says, because of you, I'm different. I'm changed. And there it is, buried in that Hebrew word that we just read right over as though it belonged in the wedding someplace, right? But think about what the narrative says. It not only gives enormous credibility to the woman, elevates her from chattel to real equality, and then says, because of her, a man changes his own identity. Pretty powerful stuff. Okay? Yes? Good. Okay. Cultural identity. That means in order to have tribal identity, I have to have cultural identity, which means that I need specific rituals, shared legends, common beliefs, and exclusive relationships. And that means, and we've talked about a lot of this stuff already, except the exclusive relationship. And that means that when it comes to the suzerain Lord, when Yod-Heh-Vah-Heh takes the children of Israel out of Egypt, when he sends Moses into Pharaoh, what does he say Moses is supposed to tell Pharaoh? Let my people go, period, right? Is that what he says? No. Let my people go so that what? Let my people go so that they may worship me. Right? And in fact, Pharaoh even suggests, well, at one point, well, yeah, go have a 3-day, worship festival and then come back. And it doesn't work that way. Let my people go so that they may worship me. In other words, they are exclusively to belong to God. Right? It was okay. And just so that you see the impact of this 1,400 years later, in the first century, because the same ideas are true in the first century in the apostolic writings, the same issues are going on, right? In the first century, the Romans never had any problems with the God of Israel at all. They didn't care about the God of Israel as long as the God of Israel could be incorporated into the pantheon of all the other gods. In other words, as long as you were going to have an inclusive religion, it was perfectly okay with the Romans. You know what the Romans cared about? Pay your taxes. That's what they cared about. The Romans cared about the money. They didn't care about the religion. You believe anything you want as long as you pay your taxes. Okay? The problem that they had with Israel is that Israel wouldn't be inclusive. Israel went around saying to everybody else, your gods are false. Those are idols. That isn't true. And Rome didn't like that because they were causing all kinds of dissension with all these people who believed that their gods were fine. And so they would say, listen, what's the problem? Zeus, Athena, Diana, Artemis, so what? I mean, 6 of this, half of that, just put, to throw Yahweh in there. What's the difference, right? I mean, you're all, doing the right thing. Everybody's going to the temple. You're all worshiping, let's get along, right? Tolerance, right? And what do the Jews say? No. And Rome says, what's your problem? I mean, look at all these other people. They got plenty of gods. Can't we just share? Right? This is the same issue that's happening here because Egypt has plenty of gods. In fact, the people coming out of Egypt, the Hebrews coming out of Egypt, are so saturated with the gods that they even say to Moses at one point, why did you drag us out here in the desert? We would have been better off back there. In other words, send us back to the pagan idolatry because at least then we weren't starving to death, right? Well, you forget the fact that they were being abused, killed, tortured, everything else, but whatever is happening now is better than what was happening before. Okay? By the way, you see the same thing in Ruth. The same issues that we find in the narrative in the Genesis-Exodus story come up over and over and over and over and over in the Bible. In fact, I used to tell my students, if you don't understand the first three chapters of Genesis and the appendix in 4, you can't understand the Bible at all. Everything that has to happen happens in those 3 chapters. Okay? So let's look at Ruth. Remember when Ruth and Naomi leave from Moab to go back, right? The 2 sons and the husband are dead. And Naomi says, okay, well, I'm going to go back to Bethlehem because they now have bread in the house of bread. And you 2 daughters-in-law, you don't have to go with me. You've been kind to me, you've been nice to me, it's been wonderful, but you should just stay here. What does she say? You should stay here and do what? Go back to your mother's house, and what else? Go back to your mother's house and to your gods. That's a powerful statement on Naomi's behalf, because what she says is, it's okay for you to become pagans again. Right? In other words, I'm so anxious for you not to go to Bethlehem with me that I'm happy to send you back to your pagan, child-sacrificing gods than to take you with me to Bethlehem. That should tell you something really important about Naomi. And what it tells you is, it raises a big, huge question. Why doesn't Naomi want the two women from Moab to come with her to Bethlehem? She's so insistent that she's willing for them to go back to their mother's house, which is already strange, and to their original gods. And there's a whole story behind that, which maybe someday I'll come back and we'll do Ruth. It's really interesting. Okay? But the story is the same that shows up in the Genesis account, because it's about exclusivity. Which God do you belong to? Right? And the culture around us, even today, is happy to have you believe in whatever God you want, as long as you let anybody else believe in whatever gods they want. And the Bible says no. There's only one God. And that is exclusivity. Okay, let's look at the next slide. Okay, so Genesis is tribal as narrative. How does Genesis describe the transcendent God in relation to the people? It creates ritual, symbol, ceremony, and narrative that draws the two together. Okay? And it shows you that the gods of the ancient Near Eastern world were completely removed, whereas the God of the Bible is completely involved. And this is a really important point. You know, the thing that you find about the God of the Bible is that he feels, right? He gets angry, he weeps, he has regrets, he gets involved with people, he has emotional connections with people, all that kind of stuff. I mean, he says to Moses, I've had it with these people. Let's just start over with you, right? He's all over the place, okay? The gods of the ancient Near East were never like that. The gods of the ancient Near East might have been fickle, and they might have been immoral, but they didn't care at all what happened to human beings, right? The Hebrew God is radically emotionally connected. Now, theology doesn't like that, especially systematic theology from the Christian side, because theology starts with the doctrine of immutability. Immutability means God can't change. And I don't mean that he just doesn't decide not to change. I mean that it's logically not possible for him to change, because if he changed, he wouldn't be God, right? A perfect being can't ever change, because if he was perfect and anything changed, then he wouldn't have been perfect now, or he would be perfect now, and that means he wasn't perfect before. It's all logical nonsense, okay? But one of the things that's really important about immutability is it has a corollary that no one wants to talk about, but it's the logical corollary of immutability, and it's called impassibility. And what it means is that a perfect being cannot feel, right? Why? Because a feeling is a transitory state. I feel good, and then I don't feel good. I feel love, and then I feel hate. I feel anger, and then I feel regret. Feelings go up and down. So, if God is immutable, he can't be passive, in pathos. You can't feel. So we have a doctrine called impassibility. And you don't have to believe me, but I will tell you that if you go to the theology books, the doctrine will be in there, and then you'll read about the early church fathers who came up with this, and they would say things like, don't preach about this, because if you tell people that God doesn't feel, they won't come anymore, right? What is the point of going to worship a God who never feels? But the point is, the Bible's God is filled with feelings. Now, how do theologians get around that? They suggest that all that language is anthropomorphic. You know what that means? It was written for you to feel better about yourself, but it really isn't about God, right? In other words, if God can't feel, because the paradigm tells me he can't, then all that language is really just God expressed in human form so that you'll feel good about yourself, right? And you'll feel like God really feels about you, but he doesn't really feel at all. So he can't really feel about you, even though you think he feels about you, right? So you'll still pray, and you'll still tithe, and you'll still go to church because you think God feels about you, but logically he can't. Sometimes I just want to be John Wayne and shoot all those guys. I mean, the theologians just drive me crazy because instead of actually reading what the text of the Bible says, they change the text of the Bible into the paradigm, right? So now, because the Bible doesn't agree with the paradigm, then the Bible's text actually doesn't say what it says. But I think it says what it says. I think it says that the God of Israel was so different than the gods of the ancient Near East that he was actually emotionally engaged with his people. And it hurt him to see them sin. And it hurt him. He wept over them. And in fact, Abraham Heschel has a fantastic book called The Prophets, which you must read. And in that book, he says that the true prophets of Israel were men and women that God chose to allow them to feel his heart. That's what a prophet really is. And a prophet is so overwhelmed by feeling what God feels that he can't help but communicate what God intends him to communicate. But it starts in the heart. It starts with a person who is overwhelmed with feeling what God feels, right? Now you know why Yeshua in front of Lazarus' tomb, there are two Greek words for weep. One of them means to shed a tear like over spilled milk. That's the word that's used when Yeshua confronts Lazarus in the tomb, right? He isn't sobbing from a deep internal stress because he knows that death is a temporary situation, right? He cries a little because the people are so distressed, right? When the word is used for Yeshua weeping so that it actually makes him sick to his stomach, that he's so emotionally stressed that it turns his stomach, that word is used when it says he wept over Jerusalem, right? Lost is much worse than die. Right? And God's perspective is the same. So Yeshua feels how God feels, and it makes him sick. He's weeping so hard, it makes him sick. Right? Okay, so that story gets incorporated into the foundation of what it means to understand who God is. And the Torah is filled with the God of emotions. So important for us. Because we come, by the way, we come from a Western world, and in the Western world, guess what? Emotions are always bad. Right? Why? Because in a Western world, the goal of the Western man is to be in control. Right? The whole idea of analysis is to predict and control. So, when somebody like this poor man here, I'm going to use you, come here. When somebody like this poor guy, he's a perfect example, right? No, come on, you can come up here. You can be on television. Okay? So here's his problem. No, it's okay. I don't bite. My son is about your size. What are you, 6'5"? 6'5"? 6'3". Yep. Oh, I took my shoes off. Okay. My son's 6'6". He's a big guy. Anyway, this is somebody close to you. Mm-hmm. Wife? Mm-hmm. Okay. So here's the problem. When you fell in love with her, every guy around you said, what's your name? Zach. They said, Zach, man, he's head over heels in love with her. He's not worth anything anymore. He can't get a thing done because he's thinking about her all the time. Man, write him off for a while. When he eventually recovers and regains control, right? Okay? The whole idea in the Greek world is that we think of love as something that disturbs the balance in our life. So, when you fell in love with her, I'm sure that there were guys who said, oh my goodness, I remember when Zach used to be like this, but now, forget it, right? And she is saying, yes, yes, yes. She wants you to be out of control. But you're struggling like crazy trying to regain your control because you're flipped out over her. You don't know what to do without her. You can't stand being away from her. And all your friends are saying, man, I used to think I knew who Zach was, but now look at him. Actually, you're being very calm. You're being very reserved. You got that control thing going, right? And is that true? I did. I picked the wrong guy. Oh, he really is a control freak. No. Huh? Oh, he's not balanced. Oh, he's very balanced. Oh, that's good. He's a good Greek because the Hebrew idea isn't about balance, right? The Hebrew idea is, look, the Greek idea is a balance scale. The Hebrew idea is a target. The idea is to get to the center. Forget all the other stuff. The only thing that matters is hitting the center, right? Balance doesn't make any difference in my life if I'm off center, right? So in our Western world, we think emotions upset the balance. So you have to have a balance. That means if you're very balanced, that means so much time allotted for work, so much time allotted for the wife, so much time allotted for your friends, so much time allotted for football, on and on, right? Okay? And here's the problem. When you get too emotionally involved with her, you have to give up something. Right? I mean, football goes by the way, and then your friends say, hey, how come you're not going to the game with her? Oh, well, I have to do something with my wife. Oh, man, this guy, forget it. There's a word for that. I won't use it, right? Okay. So the whole point is your balance got disturbed, right? But that's Greek thinking. Because in Hebrew thinking, it's about centering. And if she is the most important relationship in your life, who cares about football? He's like, you're right, I picked the wrong guy. No reaction. He's completely balanced. Right, okay? Okay, got it?
Yep.
So you're going to be Hebrew or Greek? Hebrew, awesome. Then she's the absolute center of your life. She's the Ezer Kenegdo in your life. What she says goes.
Yeah.
And we are all witnesses to that. Great, thanks, Zach. I appreciate it. Okay, so you see the differences. Oh, yeah, thank you, Zach. So the difference is this: if I believe in a world where emotions upset the balance of life, then I don't want a God who's emotional either, because it's scary to be with a God who's emotional. In fact, there's a great book by Mike Yaconelli. And it's about the dangerous God. Because here's the problem. The God of the Bible is extremely dangerous. He does things you can't even believe. Right? So in Hebrew thought, I need those. Look, parting the Red Sea, are you kidding me? That happens every day. Right? No way. Fighting off the Egyptian gods, destroying them one after another. I mean, this is a God who's unpredictable. How unpredictable is it that you march around Jericho 7 times and blow a trumpet and the whole thing falls down? I mean, come on. God could at least create a proper siege strategy. No, come on. God does things that are off the scale, right? And the result is he's dangerous because you don't know what he's going to do, right? Which means he's not in balance at all. You need to send God to anger management class because things go crazy with him around, okay? So these stories support the idea that I serve a God who is capable of doing just about anything and who will surprise me all the time. And the last thing I can do is get into a comfortable ritual or routine and think that somehow I'm going to keep God in my box. It isn't going to happen, right? It's no different than Zach thinking, just because I live like this, I can keep her under control. It doesn't work, right? It doesn't. She knows. Okay. The whole idea is, oh, and by the way, it's interesting that the Zer Kenegdo plays the functional role in a marriage that God plays with Israel, which means that she is just as dangerous as God, right? Okay? And anything can happen, okay? So, the point is the biblical text gives me a foundation for that stuff that I can't get, even in theology. It denies all that to me, right? I know it's 9 o'clock. That means it's midnight for me. And we didn't hardly even get started, did we? And there's so much more. Give me the next one. Oh, give me the next one. The meaning in history. Give me the next one. Protesting the universe. Look at all this good stuff. Give me the next one. The difference in Genesis. Oh, wow, look at that. He grants vice regency to human beings. Never happened before in any ancient mythology. Okay? Governs from compassion. Never happens before. Next one. Wow. Perspectives. The difference between a prophet and a priest. One is about relationships, a prophet, and one is about order, a priest. And all those are set up in the Genesis account. There's so much more to do here. How are we going to get it done?
Stay here.
Yeah. And it's 9 o'clock, and it is midnight for me. And there is stuff in the books out there that will help you, and some of the stuff on paradigms that I have up here. But I just want you to realize that the Genesis account is so much richer than just even the Hebraic exegesis that we usually do, because it's God's attempt to take a people like us out of a world that's filled with pagan ideas and re-educate us, just like he re-educated them, to think like he thinks. And if you start looking at the Genesis text like that, and you start asking yourself, what does this help me understand about re-education? It will change the way you think of Genesis, just as we've talked about these few little things tonight. Okay? So I'm hoping that I gave you enough teaser, just a little slice, so that maybe we can do this again sometime, or that you will go back now and reread those Genesis stories, especially the ones in the first 3 or 4 chapters. They're so fundamental to establishing how God works, right? And we touched on just a few of those, but Guardian Angel will take you through a whole bunch of stuff about what's happening in those first couple of chapters that you probably never thought of. And that helps set the stage for understanding the rest of the text and seeing all those stories that are happening. So you're going to stop asking yourself, yeah, but what about the messianic prophecies in Genesis? And you're going to start asking yourself, how do people who were slaves think about this verse? Right? Okay. I think we've gone as far as I can go. Questions? There's lots more we could talk about, but no? No questions. Wow, great. I can get some sleep.
Too many questions.
All right. I think we could carry on, though, for a little bit longer, don't you think? How are you feeling? Do you want some coffee?
No, I don't drink coffee.
I don't think we should let him go, do you?
I don't drink coffee. All right, so let's try one more. The story in the garden. We talked about the significance of the characters and the location. Who's the story for? What's the question? What story does the question address? Okay, one more. This is a good one. We'll do this one. This will be the last one. Remember that wonderful story about the Nephilim? Everybody goes crazy about the Nephilim. Oh my goodness, the angels came down and had sex with women and they made giants. Remember that nonsense? Yeah, okay. Right. Okay, so here's the question. What does sons of God mean in an Egyptian context? Did they ever use the term sons of God? Who is Tut Anka Amen? He's a pharaoh. Why is his name Tut Anka Amen? Because he is the son of the god Tut. Right? In other words, there's an Egyptian god named Tut, and the pharaoh is a son of God. What does that mean in Egyptian thinking? It means that a man claimed divinity in his ancestry and was elevated to a status far beyond ordinary mortals and treated like a god. Does that mean he was an angel? Does that mean that he was a son of God in the spiritual sense? Not at all. Because that idea was already present in ancient Near Eastern thinking. A son of God would be a wealthy, powerful noble, a royalty, a pharaoh, a king, somebody who commanded from their position of power commanded obedience over a large population. Okay? So now it says the sons of God came to the daughters of men. Okay, what's the difference between the son of God, Pharaoh, and the rest of the population? They are men. The son of God, Pharaoh, is a direct descendant of the God, which means that he represents the authority and power of the God when everybody else is just a man. So who are the daughters of men? Ordinary, no-count women. Whatever the Son of God wants to do with the ordinary no-count women, because he is the powerful authority in the kingdom, he can do. Right? In fact, we have a good example of that. We have a biblical example of that. And her name is Bathsheba. The Son of God, David, the king, who represents God. He doesn't claim that he's a son of God like Pharaoh does, but he has that status and elevation, right? He sends for Bathsheba. Do you suppose that she's going to say no? Not in that society, because you don't say no to the king, okay? And so what happens in the Genesis story in Genesis 6 is a very familiar ancient Near Eastern idea that the sons of God, who are the big rulers of that time, the kings, the princes, the wealthy, were involved in mistreating the ordinary common women. Okay? So what does that entail? What it entails is this. God judges the earth on the basis of the violence that's created because these men took advantage of their position and forced and broke boundaries that God had put in place to maintain the society that he wanted. They used their power to abuse women without a voice. And what God judges is the violence that comes as a result of that. Right? So it's not the case that the Nephilim are the result of angels having sex with, human women. It's the story that fits what happens in the ancient Near East when a powerful man uses his position to abuse a woman without a voice. And God judges that. And he says that the whole earth was filled with that kind of activity, right? With abuse of power. And as a result of that, he determines that no matter what he does, all the imaginations of man's heart are always thinking about how to abuse power, and he decides to judge the earth. It makes a lot more sense from an ancient Near Eastern perspective than trying to figure out if these are angels who come down, right?
Are you saying that now all of our stories and stuff on the Nephilim are down the toilet? Really, all of our fun that we've been having?
Yeah, we can have. You have all the fun you want, but the point is that the words have to make sense to the audience that heard them, right? So you need to ask yourself, what do the sons of God? What does that mean to ex-Egyptian slaves, Hebrews coming out of Egypt? What does the relationship of sons of God mean to them? And if you know in the ancient Near Eastern cultures that sons of God is a designation for Pharaoh and his dynasty and the powerful rulers of the ancient Near East, then all of a sudden it's a human problem instead of an angelic one. Right? Yes?
How did that create giants?
Isn't that interesting? What does the word giant mean in the ancient Near East? Does it mean 9-foot tall guys with with spears the size of, of threshing boards or whatever it was? The whole point is we read that text according to our understanding of what giants mean. What we really need to do is ask ourselves, were there any stories or mythology or uses of a vocabulary in Egyptian thinking that would associate giants with the sons of gods? Right? And the example just from from exegesis, the example is a good one, because what it will do is it will force you to stop looking at the text from a paradigm that was adopted hundreds of years later to read the text and start asking yourself, how much do I know about Egypt in order to read this text? Right? Oh, I want to show you the picture. There is a slide in here about the picture, so let's go forward a couple more. Down. Where is it? Oh my goodness. Maybe it's not in there. No, there. Genesis creation. Here it is. Okay, let's go back one more. There. This is it's actually an Egyptian, it comes from a museum, it's actually an Egyptian representation of the cosmos, of the earth, right? This is the primal sea. And this goddess is the one who prevents the forces above the heavens from infecting the earth, which is this area of men. Okay? So in Egyptian mythology, now go forward one. Okay? So here is the Hebrew conception of the universe. A great deep, the primal sea, the waters above the firmament held off by the Egyptian god, right? The earth, right, with the underworld, Sheol. And how does the earth come about? Well, in Hebrew thinking, the earth comes about because God creates it. In Egyptian thinking, the earth comes about by self-generation out of chaos, associated with the god, okay? But the pictures are almost identical. In other words, God doesn't say to his people coming out of Egypt, I'm going to rewrite your cosmology. Big Bang theory, chaos, string theory. By the way, you need to know something about Einstein, Newton. He doesn't do that, right? He takes a picture that they already have and reshapes it just enough so that it's altered from the Egyptian idea that chaos, and we talked about this, right? Chaos isn't down there to destroy everything anymore. But notice how similar it is to the Egyptian idea when it talks about the flood. It talks about the waters above the earth and the waters below the earth that was released, right? Okay, well, where do those waters come from? Is there water floating above the earth? No, but where did that idea come from? It came from Egypt. The idea that there's a God who protects me from what's happening in the heavens that can destroy me as well. That concept from the story of the flood would have been very familiar to the people coming out of Egypt, and they wouldn't have batted an eye because they knew that that's the way the world was. We have a very different view of the world, and so when we read that verse, we go around trying to explain how it could all happen, and there must have been this planet and that comet and whatever, but that isn't what was going on. What was going on is an Egyptian idea that God uses, that they're familiar with, to create a story that's not about how the flood happened. That's a Greek notion. It's how did it happen, right? That isn't the point of the story. The point of the story of the flood is why, not how, right? The point of the story of the Genesis account is why, not how. The Genesis account doesn't tell me how God did it. It tells me why he did it, which is what I need to know from a tribal perspective. I need to know why the world is the way it is. I need to know why I'm here, right? Those kinds of things help me understand Genesis as though I were the one receiving the stories from Moses. And that's where I have to go. That's what I have to get to. And by the way, it isn't just Genesis. It's all of them. It's all the Tanakh. It's the apostolic writings. You have to keep asking yourself over and over and over and over, if I were the original audience, what would it have meant to me? Right? And it's way more than we can even imagine. In fact, there's a book out there called The Lucky Life, which just looks at the Beatitudes, and says, if you were in the audience on the day that Yeshua gave that teaching, what would it have meant to you? And it's incredibly powerful stuff. The same thing I wrote a book called Crossword Puzzles, which asks the question, if I were a Jew in the first century, what would the cross mean to me? And I can tell you right now, it wouldn't mean forgiveness. Because I still have the temple. I still go to the temple every day. I'm still doing the sacrifices. I'm still doing the Nazirite vows. So the cross has to be about something else. And what it's about is incredibly powerful and goes all the way back to the Genesis account. Right? So, okay, that's all I can do. Okay.